After all of that really dystopian view of what we've actually got for our society, I think I'll start at a much more basic level. What's work? Have a think about it. How do you define work? Is it work when you clean up the garden? Is it work when you do the washing up? Is it work when you have sex with somebody? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And what's more, when you actually have sex with somebody, you might end up in labour, the really only labour, which is the production of a baby. So I think I want to sort of debunk some of the sort of stuff that we're talking about and get us to start thinking much more clearly about what we're talking about. And in the process of that, I want to start by paying my respects to the Indigenous people that started this country. They've had 60,000 years or even more, I think they're discovering at the moment, of running a place without a definition of work that was similar to us, without waged income, taking good care of country, doing all sorts of really good things about that, because they lived in a community, in a society. They didn't live in an economy. They wouldn't have known what an economy was. And that's one of the things I think we've got to address. We used to live in a society. We now live in an economy. We used to be citizens. We're now customers. We have changed our relationships very dramatically over the past few years. One of the reasons we have a huge level of distrust of government at the moment is that government's not seen as doing anything for the citizen anymore. You're a customer. Who was it was banging on the other day about, I can't understand why people pay all these high costs for electricity. If you spent every single Monday morning checking up the local electricity prices, you could get a better deal and you could save $1,200, said one of the ministers in our current government in Canberra. And you think, excuse me, I've got better things to do in life than checking up on my weekly electricity price, my weekly phone price, my weekly price on whatever else I've got and those sorts of things there. Yes, the market will get me a lower price, but who invented the bloody market anyhow? Where did that come from? I mean, we've got this discipline called economics. And I don't know how many of you here are economists. It's all right, it is, you can get over it. It's a bit like a religious fervour. If you're a true believer and a sort of, a basic, economist that thinks that, that there's this thing called Homo economicus, which is this figure which sort of turned up somewhere around the 16th, 17th century, I think it was. It came a bit out of Hobbes in a sort of variation thereof, which is that human beings are basically self-interested little male deadshits who happen to spend their entire life looking after their best interests. And therefore, if you go back to Hobbes, he said we only actually arrived as social beings because we needed to be controlled, so our evil instincts, it seems to have a sort of somewhat Christian view buried into it. The original sins had to be sort of tampered down by the fact that we had to be controlled by social control. This is the original social contract. Rousseau was a bit like that too, even though he invented the basic income. And I think we've got to sort of get back to the fact that this was a masculinized view from a Western country, which not long after that launched us into the Industrial Revolution. So we've got a sort of Protestant male Anglo thing which somehow or other took over the world. And I think as a good feminist, I think it's time that we actually started reconstructing what we were actually thinking about in terms of a society. We are social beings, we're connected beings, we are born dependent, we are interdependent. Not one single economic theory can deal with any of those things because it doesn't make you a good consumer. We actually do lots of things for each other because we're parts of families, we're parts of communities who are very, in many senses, very much socialised. Those of us who've done anthropological or sociological studies know that in terms of human behaviour, there's absolutely no case in which you can say if A, therefore B. Yet economists think that they can put it all into algorithms and that actually predicts our behaviour. It doesn't. It's capable of predicting the possibilities, probability theory, rather than causality. And I think we tend to forget that and we sort of put these economists on a pedestal. I want to go back to that basic idea about what is work, because a very large proportion of what we do is unpaid. So far, this has barely been mentioned. But if you think about it, women do the bulk of unpaid work. This is why we have something called the gender pay gap. One of the reasons we have something called the gender pay gap, partly because we do a lot of stuff unpaid, because basically whether we like it or not, we end up doing the bulk of the domestic work because men get paid more, so therefore it's very difficult for them to give up their work in order to take more time off, and we're terribly grateful to them when they take on their share. We still have a very strong gender imbalance in the household, in the community, and in the workplace in terms of the fact that gendered jobs tend to be paid more if they're mainly men and less if they're mainly women. The why a CFO should be paid more than the human resources person in a large organisation, I haven't worked out, because dollars don't walk off the page and do things human beings do. And there's no logic and things to assume that one is harder than the other. So we have a huge gender bias still within the system. And it goes back to sort of how we define that construction of work. We have paid jobs. We also have a large number of unpaid roles that don't actually get acknowledged within the system. One of the reasons I'm backing the idea of a UBI is I think it's actually a social compact between, it should be, between the nation state and the citizen, which says basically, we expect you, because you're a human being and an interdependent human being as part of a society, to actually contribute to that society by taking care of your kids, being nice to your neighbours, doing all sorts of other sorts of things there, painting things, creating art, doing all sorts of things there. And some of those you will end up getting paid for, but some of them you won't, and some of them you'll do for sheer pleasure, some of them you'll do because you have to do it. There's a whole range of reasons why we do these things, and I think we've got to be somewhat more critical about that. I mean, many years ago we ran a series of focus groups looking at skills, and we found a lot of the women in the focus groups would talk a lot when we started talking to them about the skills they had. But then when we started doing things like saying, well, and these were often women who were at home with children, and we said to them, when you go for a job, because a lot of them were moving back into the workforce, into paid jobs, do you tell them about the things you do? And they say, oh no, we can't possibly tell them about things we do, they were all unpaid. So we produced a little booklet which basically said, if you're the person that organises all the family functions, you're actually an event manager. Can you please start redefining who you are? But we actually had to tell people to do this, and this made me very conscious of the fact that we don't really differentiate between paid work, and we've been talking a lot about paid work, but we do differentiate between paid work and unpaid work in a way which I think is grossly unfair. So maybe if we have a UBI, it's one of the ways of acknowledging there's lots of things that we do unpaid. Maybe it puts us back into the sort of situation where we're talking about living in a society and not an economy. You know, when I first went back to university, sociology was a discipline that was really important. Economists were rather boring people that you occasionally found down the pub. Within about a decade, economists had taken over, neoliberal economics had taken over. I used to make my students refer to it as economic fundamentalism, not economic rationalism, which some of them foolishly did refer to it as, because there's this absolute belief in the market. If you'll excuse the expression, the market is fucked. It actually doesn't work. We have a million opportunities. Yes, it might produce certain types of goods more cheaply, but what does that mean? That we're stuffing up the environment at the same time as doing other things. You know, we produce an enormous amount of stuff and everybody says, oh, the standard of living's going up because we've got our places jammed with stuff that we end up putting out the back lane because we can't even sell them when they're, you know, even though they're functioning. We're ruining the economy. We're ruining a lot of the social system, and I think we've got to sit down and start talking about how we change these things. And it's a very basic thing to do. But I think we've got to acknowledge the fact that there are other ways of paying things, and the UBI is one of them, that we do need to look at paid work, but maybe we need to cut it down. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we went from the 40-hour week to the 37.5-hour week, then we went to the 36-hour week, then we went to the 35-hour week for some people. And then we stopped talking about cutting working hours. Whatever happened to the construct of leisure? Whatever happened to the non-work time things? I mean, Marx, when he said 8 hours work, 8 hours sleep, 8 hours enjoyment, actually ignored the fact that somebody had to do the housework, which was fairly typical. But I think, yes, I know, we've got various stories about the Marx household. But I do think that we actually need to start moving away from that construction of this sort of world of paid work as being the dominant part of our society. We're coming up to a point where we've got two things that we've got to consider. One is the whole technological thing that we've had all the sort of things about who's going to be taken over and what's going to happen and who's going to lose their jobs. I think the best thing is we can say is that the amount of demand for paid labour will probably reduce in all sorts of ways, and we need to do that. But that is not necessarily a bad thing, because maybe we can budget time instead of budgeting money. And I think that that's actually a much healthier thing to do in many ways. So we can have a look at how then we share things around, and to do that we need to have some money pooled, and the idea of a UBI definitely does that. I think we need a contract, as I say, between the nation state and the individuals, the citizens, for a whole range of reasons, and one of them is really important. It's been mentioned a couple of times tonight, but I really want to emphasise it, and that's because we need a democracy. And at the moment we are having problems, serious problems, in the fact that for a lot of voters, they do not see government as actually providing them with anything that's really of benefit to them. They have to pay to go on the roads, they have to pay for all sorts of things that were once free, they've sold off a lot of things that we used to own. You know, even the bloody post offices have sort of turned into things like that. I had a whole conversation once when I ended up on a postage stamp with the head of Australia Post, who's just resigned, and they sort of took us off to this dinner where they were celebrating me and Germaine Greer and whoever else was on the stamps. And I turned up at the thing in Melbourne, it actually was, and said to the head, whatever his name was, forgot the thing, I said, you're lucky I didn't turn up in the T-shirt today in my sort of long gown which said, don't close Glebe Post Office, which is my local post office. Oh, he said, why would you have done that? I said, because you're trying to close my local post office, and it's one of the few places in Glebe, which is a city, inner city Sydney, where the people from public housing and the people from the Glebe Point higher value thing actually mix. So it has a real function in the area of actually a symbol of both the government and, you know, the area. Oh, he said, maybe we should turn it into a community service. I said, I thought post offices were a community service. And he said, oh, no, we're a commercial undertaking. And they've just flogged the Sydney GPO, so there you are, it just proves it all. But I think this stuff is undermining our sense of what's valued. It's completely undermined our sense of what's important, and it's completely undermined our sense of our relationship to the nation state. The nation state itself is also a reasonably new invention. It turned up in the 19th century. And if you take a look at the late 19th century and some of the sort of changes that happened then, there were sort of all sorts of questions about the role of the nation state. I mean, Bismarck invented the age pension system basically because people were likely to die before they were 65, so they were fairly safe bringing it in as a welfare move. But it did at least establish the sort of principle that the government should provide something for that. So you've got that sort of build-up, and you've got the threats of the First World War and the whole thing's there. And then I just want to remind people, because it's also part of my own personal history, that after the First World War, we had a situation where the nation state was very much under threat. There was a sort of combination of the Depression and the collapse of Wall Street. There was the growth of the Communist Revolution, and there was the growth of fascist parties in Europe. Read your European history of that particular time, because there's some remarkable similarities in the attitudes that people had to the democratic process that was happening in Europe in those years. I was a refugee from Hitler at a very early age, and so I actually have this in the back of my own history. But what happened to the Weimar Republic? What happened to Italy when Mussolini turned up there, who reminds me of Trump, incidentally, I think much more so than any other politician I can think of. What happened in Franco's Spain? Was a whole lot of people thought, what we need to do is get a strong person to sort out this mess that democracy has got itself into. So what do we have now? We've got Poland, we've got Hungary, we've got the Philippines, we've got Trump, we've got Brexit. We've got a whole lot of symbols that democracy in its Western things, because after the Second World War, guess what they did? They invented the welfare state. Yeah, and so they invented the welfare state in order to find a balance between what was seen as that sort of economic thing and creating order. And that worked really well in the post-war years. And people are saying, oh, maybe it was an exceptional period. But by the 1980s, somebody reinvented the thing and we had neoliberalism. It is damaging us. I think we want to go back to the point that we are setting up a good society. We need to say economics is a means and not an end. The GDP is gross, domestic and boringly unproductive, and we need new measures of what happens. And we need to seriously think about what we mean about work and start rewarding unpaid work and paid work and start pushing for a government that actually serves our social needs and stop ourselves being customers and start getting back to citizenship. To do that, we've got to reject the fact that we actually have to worry too much about the demise of the Industrial Revolution. It's been around for a long time. And let's reinvent the sort of states that we want to live in. It's reinvent a governance that we want to live in. And remember that the idea of the nation state should have reciprocity built into it. And I think, whatever else we want to say about that, that a UBI that's appropriately designed and doesn't cut out lots of everything and isn't going to be the solution to everything could well be the thing that starts a trust relationship developing again between citizens and those that we vote into power. And I think that that's going to be vital. Thank you.